The unlimited beasts of nature, freedom-type players, go toe-to-toe against the shining stars piercing through discomfort, restrictive players. Two life forms that, by their nature, are meant to collide and wage war. A fight that far extends beyond Blue Law. This is matter versus antimatter. And so, in today's video, we are going to look at each group's stats, abilities, and figure out what truly makes them tick, in order to determine who is the more dominant faction. But before I start, I gotta say that recently I've made a video about order versus chaos within Blue Lock, which matters a little bit for today's video because even within freedom and restriction we find different types of players, and they act a bit differently depending whether they are orderly or chaotic. And so I highly recommend watching that video before this one. However, without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I give you restriction versus freedom. Freedom Seekers. In the realm of Blue Lock, players who perform better when they have a plethora of options are referred to as freedom-type players. On surface level, they are known to thrive in open systems where they can do whatever the hell they want at all times. But a deeper look would reveal a much complex way of life and playing style. Because you see, freedom-type players tend to be imaginative and creative. They love the freedom that allows them to self-express and choose what they want and how things should unfold before them. Sure, they love their options infinite and they live with that mindset, as at any given point of any game they love to have more than one route to the goal. But above all, they prefer and perform better when given the flexibility to discover themselves and what they can achieve, and they thrive in environments that nurture this specifically. They also are by nature repulsive to situations when they have fewer options, as they despise the uneasiness of being trapped. And as such, most freedom-type players, as they move up the competitive scene, tend to acquire weapons that give them more options and place them further into freedom. Think about Bachara's Jenga technique, Hiyori's change of pace dribbling, or Isagi's double gun volley. These are all weapons they acquired with the sole purpose of creating their own freedom so they can perform better in high-stakes situations and games. But since there are levels to everything in life, freedom-type players also differ from each other and their way of reacting to their environment. Some by nature create a lot of freedom around them, allowing other freedom players to thrive with them. For example, Isagi's freedom tend to seep into his teammates like Bachara and Hiyori, or think of Sai's freedom that took a whole team up a notch. But on the other hand, there are some freedom-type players that tend to collide with the rest of the team because their freedom is too chaotic and irregular and often collides with other plays. And honestly, whenever I speak of this, I need to bring someone like Charles or Shido here. Players who can't keep up with their freedom or understand it tend to either be left in the dust or collide headfirst with them, like we saw it happen multiple times with Ren. However, you have to understand, this is not binary by any means. There are freedom-type players who don't collide with their teammates, nor do they elevate them further. These tend to be geniuses more than talented learners, but more importantly, their freedom is almost always about what they can do for themselves, not for their team. Players like Chigiri, Loki, and Otoya are perfect examples of this. They thrive for what they can do for themselves, but they don't collide with their teammates necessarily. And of course, there are players in between like Bachara and Nagi, who are more about themselves, but at the same time they are such a plus for any team due to their ability to easily create chemical reactions with anyone. But the general consensus is this: freedom-type players tend to do better, or they pull off their best performance when they are given the flexibility to either express themselves and their originality, or to go with an attack pattern that they think is the best among other options. However, unlike geniuses and talented learners, who don't necessarily butt heads, in fact they are considered equals and work greatly with each other. Freedom and restriction, on the other hand, are total opposites to each other, and usually they are each other's weakness. Think about it like dark and light in any magic anime or game. Darkness engulfs light and light pierces through the darkness. As such, being in restriction is the direct weakness of freedom type players, as I stated earlier, because they like their options open-ended and they live for the flexibility to choose what they want. Freedom type players are by their nature repulsive to situations where they have limited options. In fact, I think it's much deeper, because this faction of players underperforms when exposed to the uneasiness of having a no way out, and in some extreme cases they even crumble under the sheer weight of said stress. I mean, Ryo specifically felt like his whole world ended when the freedom he had with Nagi got stripped away by Raichi in the first selection. And we are seeing it right now how Isagi is completely out of it due to Hyugo's restriction. And this is because despite being very good at managing their options, they are very lacking when it comes to managing discomfort. And obviously this differs between each player, since the more extreme the freedom of the player is, the harder it is to put him under restriction. Sometimes the sheer number of options one player presents is insanely hard to put under restriction, but at the end of the day, when the restriction is strong enough, it is really tough for them to break out of it. Sai, with all of his might, couldn't break from Rin's restriction one-on-one. Granted, he should have played into his freedom and passed the ball immediately rather than wanting to beat his brother. However, at the end of the day, that duel was completely against Sai's playing style, despite his insane dribbling ability. Rin quite literally choked the life out of Sai in that play, and this is what restriction does to freedom type players. We've seen it with Lorenzo and Kaiser before the latter awakened, we've seen it with Kunigami and Shido, and we are seeing it right now with Hyugo and Isagi. But there is a silver lining to this. You see, freedom type players that are talented learners tend to do better than geniuses when they are put under restriction. And this is because of their innate ability to play with others that could act as a form of freedom to give them more options. And again, it matters how extreme the freedom of the player is, but that's just a rule of thumb that I discovered. And an example I always like to give is when Isagi hit a wall against Ubers. His playing style led him to play with his teammates, in this case Yuki and Hiyori, in order to gain some leverage on the game. He went from not being able to do anything against Aiko's restriction once the latter unlocked Metavision, to actually tricking him twice due to Hiyori's freedom. And this small interaction here is a perfect description of the game plan of freedom type players. They thrive when they are given options, and they are really hard to deal with as long as those options are alive. From there we can say they actively develop weapons that lead them to more options, and they are very repulsive to stress and discomfort. Freedom type players are usually the leaders of their teams. They tend to score first often, and they are punishers by nature, as any new option presented by their opponents or teammates leads them to completely swallowing the game away. However, can freedom actually swallow restriction? Restriction type players, the shining stars forged in pressure. These are the players who perform better when their options disappear. They are the ones who don't seek freedom but rather actively thrive in discomfort. Because you see, in the realm of Blue Lock, these monsters are capable of weaponizing limitations to reach results only their eyes can see. However, again, that's only on surface level, because a deeper look would reveal that restriction type players are fundamentally decisive beings. They do not ask what they can do, they ask what must be done in this situation. And they basically achieve this in two ways, or I should say there are two types of restriction players. The first type of these players are what I like to call rulers, or rule creators and rule followers. And these are the ones who tend to do great in restriction in general. They perform better under defined roles, and most of their playing style revolves around applying rules or restriction to the field, because they love one variable string. And prime examples of this type of players are the likes of Hyugo, Lorenzo, Karasu, Nico, and Aiko. And by their nature, these players are the direct counter to freedom type players. They actively lower the options their opponents have, and they do not fear pressure. Rather, they actively feed on it. Because when freedom players see a wall, these restriction type players see clarity. When others panic at narrow ends, these players actually weaponize that. And whenever I speak of this, a perfect example I always like to give is when Isagi was building an attack against the U20 team. Due to how tight the U20 Japanese system, Isagi found himself with no clear path to the goal. His playing style simply crumbled. However, Karasu on the other hand found it very easy to crack open set tight defending. He did it before with Otoya and Chigiri, and then again here in this example by giving Isagi his freedom. But that's the first type for you. The second one, however, is more interesting to be honest. These ones are what I like to call rebels. They are the players who are all about breaking the rules. They are the predators of the group because they live for the sole purpose of finding ways to force their way through. They hunt opportunities and stop at nothing until they pierce through the restriction they love to put themselves in order to reach the results no one else can see. And as such, one of their signature weapons is the Predator Eyes. And this is very interesting because on surface level we all thought that the Predator Eyes are a weapon that helps the players convert their shots into goals. However, when taking a deeper look, I discovered that the Predator Eyes are about finding that small crack from where the player can force his goal through, or that very specified opportunity no one else can see but the Predator Eyes. And if you think about it, this explains how Rin used them defensively. He used them to hunt the connection between Kaiser and Isagi, because frankly, finding that connection specifically required Rin to throw away all the possibilities he should account for. He threw all the freedom away to put himself in the ultimate restriction of needing an impossible thread in order to unlock these eyes. And when he did, he looked like a monster and a beast to Isagi and Kaiser. No one expected Rin to hunt the connection between Kaiser and Isagi. However, that's not the only time the Predator Eyes were extremely impressive. Think about how Baro was able to align 4 insane players to force a goal that no one else had the foresight to even imagine. And that's what I'm talking about with these players. They are all about forcing an impossible choice that no one else can see except their own Predator Eyes. Which means the leading actors of this type are Baro, Kaiser, Yuki, and Berserker Rin. And here's the interesting part. By their nature, these players don't clash that much with freedom type players, unless the situation calls for it, which is something I will address in a minute. For now, we should know that these rebels can be compatible in a lot of times with freedom type players. For example, think how Berserker Rin works really well with Charles and Shido, or how Isagi utilized Kaiser's insane rebellious nature in order to figure out a way of how to dominate PXG in the midfield. And this is in fact very logical, because you see usually the options that these type of players create through forcing their way through act as a respite for the freedom type players from any types of restriction. And this is why against Hugo, the perfect player to play with Isagi is without a doubt the likes of Rin, Yuki, and especially Baro. However, the craziness doesn't end here with these rebels, because instead of colliding with freedom type players, they clash very hard with the first type of restriction, cause frankly they are the kryptonite to rulers. However, this is actually a one-way stream. Rulers tend to follow rebellious players just fine. It is the other way around that often ends in this type of restrictive players destroying the system set by the rulers. And of course, the perfect example of this will forever be Baro and how he rebelled against Snuffy. But a more interesting example would be actually Rin, and how he funny enough rebels against himself and his own playing style. I know, level with me for a second. You see, prior to going berserk, Rin is all about control. Yet, as soon as he goes berserk, the first player he usually rebels against is himself and his old playing style. He throws his old self to embrace his true ego, which is something very interesting in fact, and really shows how deep and complex Blue Lock is. However, let's not get things twisted. These rebels are also very capable of being rulers when the situation calls for it. At the end of the day, there are still restriction type players. Again, if the situation calls for it, they are very capable of enforcing the strongest form of restriction on other players. Think about what Rin did against Isagi or Kaiser did against Rin. However, if you think about it, this makes this type of players very special, because they are the counter for both freedom or other restriction players. But at the same time, if they are not careful, they themselves could end up helping freedom type players. And again, this shows how complex Blue Lock is. Some restriction players are the kryptonite to freedom type players, while other restriction type players could go against either and at the same time could help freedom type players. That's how complex the relationship between restriction and freedom. And thus, the question that poses itself, Can restriction destroy freedom? For how this matchup would go, I gotta say that I went into it thinking that Freedom type players would definitely win. I mean, especially because Snuffy and Isagi are Freedom type players, right? Well, not quite. First of all, I want to address Snuffy because I know he seems Freedom type player when he played. However, his system that he employed is definitely restrictive, and so I am still perplexed with him, and thus, to be honest, he is not as credible for this matchup. On the other hand, Isagi is actually a very special case, and I will explain that in a second. You see, the question of who is better, restriction or freedom type, is honestly straightforward. When they are put against one another, who tend to perform better? Well, you see, freedom type players tend to perform better at the beginning of every game. They tend to score the first goals and they tend to dominate the game. However, as the game progresses, things take a turn. You see, even when we ignore restriction type players, when freedom collides, it tends to create restriction for itself. By actively accounting and countering all the options your opponents have, you are, without knowing it, creating restriction for that player. Think about what Isagi did to Ness and Kaiser before the latter awakened. His insane freedom really pushed them towards restriction, and this is the first point. The second point is that the highest level of games tend to be restrictive. No matter how I try to think about it, the thing that made the Ubers, PXG and Friends games so insane is the fact that they all are restrictive, and they all really pushed Isagi to his limits through that restriction. And this is because at the highest of extremities, restrictive players tend to do better. Obviously, the first reason is the one that I just spoke of, but also any high level requires an insane level of control over the game. And thus, as we typically see, restriction type players are often more successful than freedom types. And the very few times when freedom type players perform far better is actually when they work together or when they work with rebels in order to pierce through the restriction. However, if you need a restriction type player in order to beat restriction, then by definition restriction is stronger. And this is without me including the Predator Eyes. However, let's not take my word for it. If we look at the U20 players, the insane restrictive players are Hugo, Lorenzo, Kaiser, Baro, Ren, and recently Karasu. Then when we look at freedom, we have Sai, Isagi, Charles, Bachira, and Shido. However, three of these insane players actually crumble hard under restriction. I'm talking about Shido, Charles, and Bachira. And the fact they all required insane restriction players like Karasu and Rin in order to perform should tell you everything about where they stand. However, what about Isagi and Sai who performed better? Well, one-on-one they both crumbled under Ren, but I would say Isagi had a better performance. However, I think that's due to his adaptability more than it is due to his freedom. And so I think he is more of a special case than someone who would swing things for freedom type players. And even when we go to the pros, Noah being the prime restrictive player has constantly destroyed freedom type players, whether be it Levi, Prince or Loki. In fact, Loki knows that he requires both Hugo and Charles' help in order to reach his Noah's level. And I know one-on-one Noah could never beat Prince. However, he still was capable of putting him in extreme restriction, where the second best in the world was not performing as he should be. And so from all of this, from the fact that restriction players tend to be more dominant, and from the fact that they have the Predator Eyes, I think they are the winners of today's matchup, and honestly it's not even close. And so restriction type players are the ones walking with the W. However, that's all I've got for you today guys. I really hope you enjoyed the video, and until next time, thank you for watching.